Hey everyone, I'm Chris Scott with Fit Recovery. This video is about what rehabs will not tell you about quitting drinking. And it's based on my experience as well as the experiences of the thousands of people that I've communicated with since I quit drinking and founded Fit Recovery. I have about 5 years alcohol free at this point, and this is a subject that is really a huge passion of mine. So as you can see, there's a whiteboard behind this image here, or behind this text, and my penmanship is really bad, so I decided to make a slideshow instead of just talk in front of the whiteboard. So Rehab once told me, they said AA works if you work it, and everything else is a scam. They said that people who don't go to AA are not really sober. They said don't waste your money on supplements. We were actually encouraged to make fun of those crazies out there who thought you could cure the disease of addiction with vitamins. But they said if you slip, which you probably will, because 90% of you are just no match for this disease, you can come back here and spend another $20,000. So as you can imagine, that wasn't exactly encouraging. And what ended up happening was that I went to detox and I spent some time in inpatient rehab, and I white knuckled for months until I consumed a number of books and started taking basic supplements that you might have learned about in my other videos or on my website, fit-recovery.com. And that's when I really started to feel like the color was restored to my life. And that's, I think, the biggest strategy is nutrient repair. But we're going to talk about a number of other strategies. These are all things, what we're going to cover here, that I wish had been covered in rehab, or at least mentioned as a possibility, instead of this one size monolithic dogmatic approach of you work the steps, and if you can't do it, it's your fault because you're fundamentally dishonest with yourself. So let's return to my whiteboard for a second. I came up with this idea, or this the concept of, what are the things that I wish I'd learned when I was in rehab that would have made my recovery easier? What can I share with other people to help them who might be in my former shoes? And so I just started furiously writing after my workout, and I cover some things here that are from some previous videos. I have a video called The Recovery Hierarchy, the hierarchy of alcohol recovery. And that's a very brief video, and I am standing in front of this very whiteboard discussing some of these concepts. So this is basically the biopsychosocial spiritual model of alcohol recovery, adapted from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as well as from Dr. Daniel Amen, who's a famous psychiatrist who does brain scans, and then he tries to holistically treat people instead of throwing pills at them. And I would argue that the rehab industry throws a one-size-fits-all solution at people, and occasionally they do throw pills too. I was encouraged to take antidepressants, but what I wish had been done in retrospect, and what really did help me in my self-initiated journey, and self-initiated journeys are not exactly encouraged in the rehab industry for obvious reasons, but also because it conflicts with the surrendering yourself. But what I wish they had told me was that there were things I could do. Nutrient repair is something I've already mentioned. Diet optimization. Everyone needs a different type of diet. And sometimes eliminating foods that you might be allergic to, or starting to eat more foods that you react well to, can increase your sense of well-being, and that in turn can increase your ability to focus on those psychological or emotional problems that you need to tackle and figure out in order to become really healthy mentally and well-adjusted. Exercise, I think that fits into the biochemical realm here. Daily routines, what's your morning routine? What's your evening routine? How can you crowd out alcohol from your schedule? And of course, ingestible alternatives to alcohol. So we'll talk about some drugs here. We'll talk about some other supplements. Then in the psychological realm, there are things like reframing alcohol. I have a book called Drinking Sucks, and it's been very well received. Drinking Sucks is a giant reframe of drinking, of alcohol. And when you reframe something, you're taking control of the perspective with which you view it. I saw a lot of people in rehab who were not taking control of the frames through which they viewed their lives. They simply thought, woe is me, I'm stuck, or I'm defective, I'm not allowed to drink like everyone else. And there was no attempt made really to arm them with strategies that they could use to not feel like they were living in deprivation. So in the social pillar, we have things such as changing your environment. Now, obviously, rehab encourages people to go to sober living facilities, which is not something I necessarily agree with. There are a lot of jokes about these places because they tend to be poorly run, but you do want to make proactive changes in your environment. As soon as I got back to my apartment, I changed all of the furniture. I rearranged things to feel like I had a fresh new start. I got rid of particular pieces of furniture that reminded me of drinking. Social support is also really important. You want to make sure that you have confidants. These people, if you were to listen to the most ardent 12-step counselors at rehab centers, would have to be either your sponsor or so-called sober buddies. But I honestly found that my best support structure after quitting drinking came from my good friends who I knew were my good friends all along. I did dispose of the drinking buddies, but I didn't stop talking to those people who I used to drink with, because most people drink in our alcohol-obsessed society, but who were really genuine friends all along. They're still my best friends to this day. They're really proud of me, and I couldn't have done it without them. And I can't imagine not talking to them anymore and trying to have a new crew of so-called sober buddies, 90% of whom were apparently going to relapse anyway. So then, of course, in the spiritual pillar of the recovery hierarchy, we have things like finding your why. What's your purpose for being? What identity do you want to work towards? What's your true self? And of course, this sounds a little bit woo-woo or new age, but I think it's important to ask the questions. You want to have something that you're striving towards. I sometimes call this my recovery horizon. I don't say I'm in recovery anymore. I say I'm recovered. But when I was in recovery, I had this horizon of things. It was like a bright mental image of my future. Perhaps it was just a short video in my mind of what a day would be like, with myself being fit and happy and out doing the things that I wanted to do, maybe running my own business. And all of these things have slowly and surely come true since I quit drinking. And of course, it's not a linear path, but it is important to have things that you're working on spiritually and professionally, and I think those two realms kind of intertwine. Now, the reason I put transcendence at the top of this pyramid is because we want to get to the point where we transcend alcohol. This is something that no one ever told me about when I was at rehab. The idea that alcohol could be a moot substance was not discussed, and it might have been considered somewhat silly or blasphemous even, because, of course, if you follow their model, you go to meetings for the rest of your life every single day, and you basically talk about alcohol or its absence. When you're focusing on the absence of something, you're still focusing on that thing. We want to get to the point where alcohol is not something that you have any important reaction to. You want to rewire your brain. When you combine biochemical rebalancing with psychological reframing and working towards things that make alcohol seem silly and petty and stupid in comparison, then you've gotten to the point where you've transcended alcohol. And I've seen some people do that in as little as 6 months, but you can't do it if you follow what is unfortunately the status quo recommendations of rehabs today. So there's a little recap of what I mean by the hierarchy of recovery, and I think everything else is really subsumed by it here. We'll talk about harm reduction, we'll talk about some cutting-edge methods, we'll talk about some underutilized medications, some evidence-based stuff that is not well known, even though they do have studies behind them. Then we'll talk about what I call the Holy Grail, which is where I think alcohol recovery is going to go in the next 10 to 20 years, maybe even sooner, and that's science-based customized treatment. And then, of course, we'll talk about some questions that I think are logically led to if you start realizing that there are a bunch of holes in traditional alcohol recovery. Now, I say predisposition is not the same thing as predetermination. Neuroplasticity rules. Now, what on earth does that mean? It means that if you're predisposed to alcohol addiction, it does not mean that you are predetermined to be addicted to alcohol your whole life. Neuroplasticity is the property of the brain by which it can rewire itself and heal and literally change itself. So those brain changes that rehab centers love to show you in presentations with the changes in the brain, therefore it's a permanent disease. Well, guess what? Those changes are actually dwarfed by the changes that occur when you successfully recover. So I would say one of the key takeaways of all of this and everything you're about to learn about is that the brain is a remarkably adaptive organ. Now, I know I just talked about the hierarchy of alcohol recovery, but I want to return to this for a moment because it's very useful, I think. So you see the biopsychosocial spiritual pillars and, of course, transcendence of addiction at the top. Now, many 12-step followers have benefited from this. I have people in my course who go to AA. So in case you're mad at me saying, Chris, stop dissing my program, I'm not dissing your program. My motto is, one of my mottos is, whatever works. Just do whatever works for you. Everyone is different. Now, this is a strategy for life optimization, even beyond recovery. Because, as I said, I don't think about alcohol anymore. I don't have alcohol cravings. But whenever I have a problem, I think, am I biochemically unstable? Do I need more sleep? Is there something holistically I could do to fix it? Is there a psychological reason that I'm not thriving right now? Is there a social reason? Is it someone that I'm hanging out with that I shouldn't be hanging out with? Is it a spiritual problem? And so this is really a chart that can help me figure out, identify the nature of what I'm struggling with at any given time. Now, 99% of rehabs out there ignore the biochemical pillar. They also ignore the concept of empowerment because they preach powerlessness. Evidence shows that people who are depressed benefit from being empowered. So, for example, if you had PTSD and you were depressed and you went to see a competent psychologist, what they would do is help you relive that memory and confront it so that you could emerge from it empowered and able to deal with daily life. I would argue that what rehab does with alcohol is the polar opposite. They actually encourage you to develop a sort of phobia toward alcohol itself. Now, individualized needs is something that I think rehabs ignore as well. In a sense, they're prescribing divine intervention to everyone who comes in because AA is based on a higher power. But beyond that, there are individualized needs that go unmet at these places. And each of these needs, I would argue, fit into one of these pillars: biological, psychological, social, or spiritual. Now, life purpose, I think this fits squarely into the spiritual realm. The irony is that rehab focuses on giving your will away to a higher power and trying to get rid of your defects of character, which allegedly contributed to your alcohol addiction, but they don't focus on, in my experience, helping you to draw out a positive life narrative and purpose that could help you envision what life could be in the absence of alcohol. They don't focus on that, and I find that to be quite odd, actually. So let's talk about harm reduction, which is a form of blasphemy in most abstinence-based rehab centers. And in the one I went to, it was never mentioned. So what is harm reduction? It's basically, they would say, it's substituting one addiction for another. Now, I don't see it that way. I see it as reducing the harm of continuing to drink the way you were, or switching alcohol for something that is less harmful that you can then wean off of. And in some instances, people do switch to certain substances for the long term. So we have methadone clinics for people who are addicted to heroin. I'm not arguing that methadone is the best method, but that's clearly a harm reduction method. And I think it's interesting that rehab centers have mostly embraced this form of harm reduction for people addicted to opiates, and yet they don't embrace any form of harm reduction for people addicted to alcohol. So kratom and kava are two forms of harm reduction that I embraced within about a year of quitting drinking. I don't use them often. I've gotten a lot of criticism from some people who are very confused and haven't read my articles, don't understand that I have a nuanced approach to this issue. I can tell you that I have seen hundreds of people who have switched from alcohol to kratom, and probably dozens of people who have switched to kava, and they then have a much easier time getting off of kratom or getting off of kava than they would have quitting alcohol. And the benefit to doing this is that they've constructed a new neural pathway in their brain that corresponds to kratom or kava. And so the drinking neural pathway slowly but surely begins to dissolve. Now, of course, some people do get hooked on kratom. It can be addictive. And I don't want to get into the controversy surrounding kratom because I could talk about it for hours, but I will simply say that it is a method of harm reduction that some people have successfully used, and I can say that for sure. Now, cannabis and CBD, another form of harm reduction. These are all natural forms of harm reduction that we're talking about so far. Obviously, there's the marijuana maintenance program, which I was encouraged to snicker at when I was in rehab. You know, just a bunch of potheads switching out their alcohol for weed. But in retrospect, I remember when I was laughing in that room, being encouraged to laugh, I was with two guys that, had they tried that, they might be alive today. But they were thrown into the abstinence-only approach which I'm not dissing abstinence either. I'm abstinent. I do not drink. However, something didn't work for them. One of them died of cirrhosis and the other died of an alcohol overdose. So I wonder, what if these people had been introduced to some form of harm reduction that could have worked for them? So I look back and I think, it's easy to laugh at weed or people who smoke weed all the time, but when there are such appalling relapse rates, then why aren't we considering all of the options? And CBD is yet another compound that I could talk for hours about, but I will avoid that temptation here. The Sinclair method is another form of harm reduction. I was legitimately pissed off when I realized that information about the Sinclair method had been withheld from me at rehab. The Sinclair method involves taking naltrexone an hour before you drink, and over time, you eventually stop associating alcohol with pleasure because it blocks endorphins. So it is a biochemical strategy. I mean, it is a medication strategy, but nonetheless, a biochemical strategy for rewiring your brain away from alcohol addiction. And it's said to have up to an 80% success rate. There are some people who shouldn't do it, and you do need to get naltrexone prescribed by a doctor. I should also say that of the people that I've seen do the Sinclair method, the people with the best success also changed their diet, improved their diet, and took supplements to repair their brain-body system from the negative changes caused by alcohol consumption over the months or years. Baclofen is yet another drug that is a little known form of harm reduction, and it targets GABA receptors, and some people take it long term, mostly in France, because that's where the doctor, I think his name was Olivier Amizin, came up with this protocol. He was a famous cardiologist, if I'm not mistaken, who had a very bad case of alcohol addiction himself, and he titrated himself up to a dosage of baclofen that eventually made him indifferent to alcohol. So yes, it's controversial, but it's worked for people. And I think that people deserve to know what their options are instead of having information withheld from them about their health. Now, a fitness lifestyle is something that I wasn't going to put here, but I decided to because this was really my number one form of harm reduction. You could say that I switched my addiction to alcohol to an addiction to healthy living and fitness. And I can tell you that the consequences of my addiction to health is astounding. I am in much better physical condition. I look better. I feel better. Contrary to the warnings that I got at rehab, I did not become addicted to protein powder, and I did not start skipping events or skipping work in order to go to the gym. The real result of the fitness lifestyle for me was that it brought my sense of well-being to a whole new level, and combined with supplementation, it allowed me to really reach the pinnacle of well-being that I think was even genetically possible for me. So I was able to undo so much of the damage that alcohol did to me over the years that I drank because I got back into shape and I started taking a proactive approach toward my health. I learned which supplements were great for me. And I think that the unwillingness to provide people with the full range of information about any of these harm reduction methods stems from a view of people who have been addicted to something as people with so-called addict brains. And so basically they view you as a child playing with fire for your whole life. And so we don't want to give that child any fire that they could burn themselves with. And honestly, I think that this is an infantilizing view towards people who are recovering from addiction, especially given that the only meta study ever done on the subject of cross addiction actually concluded that people who have successfully recovered from one substance are actually less likely to develop a new substance, which brings me to another one of my mottos, which is respect your brain. My number one thought is be very careful. You don't want to go through again what you went through with alcohol. And guess what? I never have. I'm not doomed by my so-called addict brain. I'm not a perpetual child. I'm not fundamentally defective or irresponsible. And I highly doubt that you are either. You deserve to know all the information. Now, of course, the best thing that you can do in terms of harm reduction is find your passion and get addicted to it. I remember we had a debate with one particularly closed-minded, dogmatic, somewhat depressing counselor about whether anyone who had ever achieved anything in the world, like groundbreaking discoveries with their obsession qualified as an addict. And he said, yes, they probably did. And so we forced him into a corner and said, well, would it be best for the world if they hadn't come up with their invention? And he said, well, they weren't mentally healthy, so I don't know. But I honestly think that becoming obsessed with something that furthers your life and or career and or family is an amazing thing to do, because there's so much good that you can bring to the world. Think about the energy that you've directed towards your addiction. Imagine projecting that energy instead of inwardly and self-destructively, directing it outwardly and for the betterment of the world. You would start to get a buzz from the fulfillment that you would feel from doing that. And that's been my experience with fit recovery. I am now equally obsessive about fit recovery as I was about alcohol, and I'm equally obsessive about working out as I was about alcohol. And I have not seen any negative consequences of this. I am living the life that I never thought I would actually be able to achieve. You can do the exact same thing. You just have to find the right places to channel your energy toward. And I would argue that for some people, that's not always the inside of an AA room. So here's another topic that you likely won't learn about if you attend a rehab center in the US, and that is cutting edge methods and emerging research. Now, I want to be careful the way I frame that, because there are a few rehab centers out there that do specialize in some of the methods that I'm about to share. So I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the so-called Minnesota model, the AA-based 12-step approach rehab centers that have a one-size-fits-all, predominantly spiritual ideology regarding addiction. So the first thing you won't learn about will be nutrient repair. Now, this could be oral or IV supplementation. I found that a lot of rehab centers actually started copying the articles that I wrote years ago about various nutrients for alcohol withdrawal, for alcohol recovery. And so they pay lip service. But what they actually do is they get traffic from those articles on Google, and then they channel people into 12-step centers where those people never hear about those topics again. So be careful if you get your information from rehab centers about nutrient repair. I cover this subject to some extent in my book, Drinking Sucks. I cover it extremely thoroughly in my course, Total Alcohol Recovery 2.0, and there are a number of good books on it. Check out Charles Gant, check out Joan Matthews Larson, check out Julia Ross. Nutrient repair is the number one strategy in my experience for people who want to feel better after they quit drinking, or who need biochemical help while they cut down on alcohol. And we're talking basic vitamins, basic minerals, basic amino acids, basic fatty acids, things you can literally get on Amazon, but you have to know what you're doing. So it's a subject that is absolutely worth educating yourself about. Now, NAD plus therapy would be an offshoot of nutrient repair. Now, NAD plus is a derivative of vitamin B3 or niacin, and scientists are still determining the mechanisms by which it works, but people are going to NAD plus IV infusion centers so that they can detox from addiction. It's been shown to help people detox from alcohol as well as numerous other drugs and help them feel much better than before. And people are also using it for anti-aging purposes. So this is something that you can also try in oral form. There's a supplement called nicotinamide riboside. There are also some pure NAD supplements, another one called NMN. And so this is a promising area of research that I think everyone should at least know about if they are quitting drinking. Psychedelic therapy is another area of emerging research. I actually had a private client who was struggling with depression, and it had been lifelong episodes of depression that were also becoming a symptom of his post-acute withdrawal. So in order to prevent him from returning to alcohol, he had to deal with this depression, which had been going on for a long time. And he said that he ate some magic mushrooms, and I did not direct him to do this. Obviously, as a coach, I don't prescribe anything. I provide support and information similar to what you're getting here, but more customized. And he said, Chris, I decided to try magic mushrooms. I read some of the research on it. My depression has been gone. And a few months later, he was still doing awesome. So it's something that scientists are looking into. It's not just psilocybin, which is the active compound in magic mushrooms, but also they're studying LSD, ibogaine, ayahuasca, and MDMA, a number of psychedelics may have some promise for treating alcohol addiction or helping to eliminate that phase of post-acute withdrawal, which is why you feel so crappy after you quit drinking and inevitably leads some people back to the bottle. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a relatively new technique. It's not something that I've ever done, but I will say that I've had some people reach out to me and say that they've had this procedure done and it changed how they felt. It changed how they perceived drinking. And if I were quitting drinking today, I would definitely look into TMS. Neurolinguistic programming, or NLP, is something that actually did help me. I would say that this is a cutting edge method, and really anything that comes after 1935 is a cutting edge method in alcohol recovery because that's what their treatment protocols are based on. I would define NLP as a system that helps you to change your responses to triggers and cues and to change your perspective on the world, on yourself, and in this context on drinking culture and toward alcohol. And so a lot of people have used reframing techniques, that's NLP, anchoring techniques, basically a sensation or a sound or a particular phrase. For me, it's my meditation mantra that is then used to evoke a certain mental state. So NLP can be very useful for helping you to change your mental state and thereby to take control of your life. Now, emotional freedom technique, or EFT, people call it tapping, is, for me, this is somewhat like TMS in that I've not done it, but I've heard from so many people that have benefited from it that I think it deserves to be mentioned for anyone who's in alcohol recovery. And as far as I can tell, it's a technique that helps you to deal with stress, to deal with past trauma, and I'm not sure exactly how it works, but I know that there are some awesome books on it. If you go to Amazon and just look for books on EFT or tapping and be sure to look at the reviews first, this could be a subject that could help you out. Now, customized diet. Diet itself, this is something in the biochemical pillar of alcohol recovery. I think diet is really underrated, and I'm probably channeling the zeitgeist and sounding like everyone else out there when I say this, but if you can find out the best diet for you, you're going to increase your biochemical stability, which is going to allow you to summon the energy that you need to work on those deeper problems. So for me, I do best with a low carb diet with a lot of high quality protein and good fats. I don't do especially well, as far as I can tell, with super low carb, like no carb, keto. And I don't seem to do especially well with high carb diets, low fat type diets. I definitely need fat. But everyone's different, and of course, keto is something that is the subject of a lot of research. I have heard from a lot of people who I'd say probably 24 people so far in the last year who have said that they're on keto and they have found it to be very helpful in maintaining a positive sense of well-being and to help with alcohol cravings. So this is another rabbit hole that's very controversial and I don't want to go down it, but customized diet is definitely something to consider. Figure out what's the best diet for you because it's going to help you in the long run. Now, we've only scratched the surface because there are so many methods that you can use to enhance your alcohol recovery and bring your life to a new level. And there's really a fine line where alcohol recovery ends and life optimization begins. So I'll just say that some other topics that some people have told me have helped, and I have some experience with all of these things, is hypnosis, acupuncture, cryotherapy, yoga, breath work. All of these things can be used as part of your recovery program. Obviously, none of them are probably the magic bullet. It's not like you just need to go get hypnosis once and then you'll be fine and forget about alcohol. There's probably some combination of the cutting edge methods, and I would argue that nutrient repair would be the most universal one, if not, one that everyone needs. Of course, there are some people who are mainly psychologically addicted, but I've found that pretty much everyone who thinks they're only psychologically addicted still benefits from some degree of nutrient repair. But in summary for this topic, I think it's a real disservice that the people are not informed of these things as areas that are worth looking into. So let's talk about underutilized medications. So there are a couple here. The first is naltrexone. We already briefly touched on the Sinclair method. I was actually prescribed naltrexone by the treatment center that I went to, so they didn't ignore it totally, but they didn't tell me the proper way to use it. There's actually no evidence that naltrexone taken in the absence of alcohol will prevent relapse. But there is evidence that if you take naltrexone as a form of harm reduction, in other words, an hour before your drinking session, you will eventually stop tying alcohol in your mind to pleasure because you will be blocking your opiate receptors, your endorphin receptors. So naltrexone is something that rehab centers will prescribe, but ironically, they won't tell you the right way to do it. I'm not saying that everyone should use naltrexone. I'm just saying that this is an example of a medication that's underutilized in the way in which it would be most effective. Pharmacological extinction is the name of the process that happens when people lose the desire to drink alcohol with the help of naltrexone, and that was not explained to me when I was at rehab. Baclofen, which is something that we also touched on earlier, and I include the name Amiz in there, the last name of the doctor who came up with it as a treatment for alcohol addiction, is probably not something you'll hear about at any rehab center in the U.S. It is, as I said, controversial, and it's not approved by the FDA, unlike naltrexone, for treating alcohol addiction. Acamprosate is an FDA-approved medication for alcohol addiction. It's also known as Camprol, and it was never discussed once when I was at rehab, and I am not sure why they might have been hesitant to prescribe it. I'm not saying that I necessarily would have taken it, but it would have been nice to know that there was something there that could help with anxiety. It actually helps to reduce the GABA and glutamate imbalance that persists for many people who quit drinking and doesn't go away. It's very helpful for some people who have severe post-acute withdrawal, which I did, and luckily I found supplementation, which totally precluded me from having to take any medication. But studies show that acamprosate is useful in reducing relapse rates for people who quit drinking. So I don't know why it's underutilized, but it is something that you should know about, and there are people out there who should be taking it, as evidenced by the fact that it does help some people. So that's why I wanted to mention it here. Topamax is prescribed off-label. It should probably, in my opinion, be approved for alcohol addiction, but I believe its patent has expired. It's also known as topiramate. I've heard from a number of people who have taken Topamax off-label. They've had doctors suggest it to them. Often these are doctors who are not run-of-the-mill doctors, but people who specialize in alcohol addiction and are aware that Topamax can be very useful for certain people struggling with long-term anxiety or depression issues after getting off of alcohol who don't want to take antidepressants. Now, again, it's not for everyone. None of these medications are for everyone. I ultimately stopped taking the naltrexone that I was prescribed because it was numbing the pleasure that I got from working out or from eating food and doing all sorts of other things that should be fun. But I think that these 4 medications should be common knowledge for anyone who goes to rehab. And obviously, we don't decide whether we take medications. We have to talk with our doctor and figure out if it's appropriate for us. But the fact that there was no information on them was kind of odd, in retrospect. And I do recall hearing about one drug, which I haven't listed here because it's not underutilized. It's called Antabuse and or disulfiram. And the reason that I didn't include Antabuse in this section is because I think it is somewhat sadistic or masochistic. And basically what it does is it makes you very, very, very sick. And there have been some reported fatalities if you drink alcohol and you take Antabuse. It basically deactivates an enzyme that your body needs to get rid of acetaldehyde, which is the most toxic byproduct of alcohol. So I am not a fan of excess cell damage, and nor am I a fan of negative reinforcement with dire physical consequences, which is why I think that it is somewhat medieval that these rehab centers tend to promote Antabuse, and that was one drug that I heard about pretty much every day. I was encouraged to take it, and I decided, hell no, I don't want to drink. I don't want to take Antabuse. It's not for me. But I do wish that I'd known about some other options at the time that might have been perhaps a little bit more helpful. So now I'd like to talk about what I think alcohol recovery could become in the next 10 or 20 years, hopefully before then, if we can break the monopolistic hold of the ineffective so-called Minnesota model of addiction treatment. Now, the first and most important thing is targeted elimination of post-acute withdrawal syndrome. This is also known as PAWS, and it is the reason that so many people have anxiety, insomnia, and depression for up to a year after they quit drinking. It's not because you're a defective person. It's not because you need alcohol to feel good. It's because your brain needs to rewire itself, and it's because you have deficiencies in nutrients and neurotransmitters and hormones. In other words, natural bodily compounds that you can replenish if you want to, and eliminate those god awful symptoms that almost led me back to the bottle. But I discovered nutrient repair or supplementation as a method for eliminating post-acute withdrawal. Some people need extra help, and that's why I covered some of those drugs which are underutilized. But this would be the number one goal, because I bet if we could eliminate post-acute withdrawal, success rates for alcohol recovery would go through the roof. And actually, the only study that I have seen on nutrient repair was one done for Joan Matthews Larson's center in Minnesota. I think it's called Health Recovery Center. And it followed up with people 3 years after they did nutrient repair, and it found that it had a 73% success rate. Now, contrast that to the 5 to 10% success rates that you see for standard Minnesota model rehab centers, and that's a hell of an improvement. Now, the next thing that I think would be important would be to address individual missing links in the hierarchy of recovery that I discussed before. So we need to figure out what those biochemical missing links are. What are the specific neurotransmitters that a person is deficient in? Do they have a serotonin deficiency that's worse than all the others? Have they had a lifelong GABA deficiency? Do they have something going on with their dopamine receptors? These are not questions that we can answer definitively as lay people, but these are questions that scientists are on the verge of being able to answer. In addition to those biochemical missing links, we also want to know what psychological, social, and spiritual missing links there could be. Obviously, someone with PTSD who has flashbacks that compel them into the drinking cycle again has a different need in terms of treatment than someone who slid into alcohol via boredom or because they got laid off at work. I think that if we really want to successfully rehabilitate people, we need to look at what's going on in their own lives instead of putting this ideology on them from above and saying, this is the way, this is the only way we've seen work. We need to look at the specifics of their lives and also the specifics of their biochemistries. I also think that alcohol recovery will eventually focus on transcending alcohol. In other words, making alcohol and even recovery itself, yes, I said it, into a moot matter, a settled thing, a phase of life, so to speak, that you've grown beyond because you're doing such awesome things in the present and you have such awesome things planned for the future. Holistic optimization is the first step toward transcending alcohol, because if you physically feel like crap, then you're always going to return to the thing that once made you feel good. So I think that's why the biochemistry is so important. Building an empowering narrative for yourself is something that I stress, and for me, I had to find a way to look at my life that didn't make me feel depressed and that instead made me okay with my past and satisfied to live in the present while also being future oriented, looking to the future, having things planned that made me excited to get out of bed every morning. This is not the kind of thing that you hear at rehab. What I heard when I was at rehab was more along the lines of redemption, redeeming myself for defects of character that led me to drink. And I couldn't disagree with that more, because while none of us are perfect, I don't think that the redemption mentality, which is really an outgrowth of American Puritanism, if you retrace AA back to the religious organizations that influenced its founders, that's really what it is. I think that having instead a empowering narrative instead of a redemption narrative would be helpful. Building meaningful connections is an example of the fine line between alcohol recovery and life optimization itself, because in order to be mentally healthy, we have to engage in social relationships that mean something to us. When I was in rehab, there was a lot of talk about my new sober buddies who I was in rehab with and the importance of building a sober network. And as nice as some of the people were, they weren't my best friends. They weren't going to be my confidants. And I'm actually one of the few people that I know in my physical life away from fit recovery who doesn't drink. And it's not been a problem at all. I think that there needs to be some guidance about how to find the confidants that are most effective for you. I don't agree with the way in which rehabs try to funnel people into sober living homes with often disastrous consequences. Now, a sense of purpose. This fits squarely into the spiritual pillar of alcohol recovery. This is also an example of the need for customization because no two people have the same purpose in life. I was never once asked in rehab what I wanted to do with my life, which is kind of bizarre when you think about it. You would think that everyone had the same life's purpose, which was to sit in meetings for the rest of our lives and to not drink, which is a negative. So I think that in order to totally rehabilitate people and get them through that spiritual pillar of recovery, we're going to have to focus on getting people excited to use their best talents out in the world. And there was literally none of that. And I honestly think that if I were to have brought that up when I was at rehab, I would have been told that I was on the verge of sliding into workaholism. And that's kind of absurd because not everyone's sense of purpose has anything to do with their profession. But again, there was no discussion of what anyone's unique sense of purpose was in life. There was only a discussion about life in the fellowship, as they like to call AA. Now, I want to clarify something in the title here. I say precision nutrition and medicine. The word precision here in either context, either precision nutrition or precision medicine, means that we are tailoring the diet or the supplement regimen or the medication regimen to the person. What I'm arguing for here is for an application of that concept to the totality of the hierarchy of alcohol recovery for each person. Now we could take we could take genetic tests, blood tests, we could look at all sorts of different biomarkers, come up with the perfect regimen for a person, determine which medications they might react well to, determine which supplements they should be using, determine what kind of diet they should have. And then, of course, we could take a look at their psychological and social and spiritual lives and come up with a customized plan for them to maximize their chances of thriving in the world without alcohol so that they can actually transcend it once and for all. So maybe this seems like pie in the sky. I know we're not there yet, but this is precisely the type of mindset that I think could immensely help rehabs out there today, if they're listening, fix their appalling relapse rates and start rehabilitating 90% of people instead of 10% of people. So here are some questions that I've grappled with. And I don't want to get into any of these in too much detail, but I think maybe some of these questions will come to you as well after listening to this presentation. But the first is, why are $20,000 plus programs stuck in the 1930s? I do think that it's tragic that people are spending their entire life savings or their kids' college savings just so that they can go get bused to free meetings and told that they have a permanent spiritual disease. Now, the second question is, why are nutrition and addiction optional in most medical schools? Apparently, doctors don't spend very much time at all studying the so-called disease of addiction. And this is whether it's a disease is something I'll be discussing soon. But why is nutrition an optional elective in medical schools? It doesn't make sense to me. And I have some friends who are very, very smart doctors. I'm not putting doctors down, but I think that if we want to fix this epidemic of addiction, we need to have better answers from doctors than just, quit drinking. If you're drinking too much, just quit. I've heard that. Or just go to AA or just go to rehab, which unfortunately funnels people back into the same problems that my little presentation here is attempting to grapple with. So why does the current model prevail despite lack of evidence? That's a great question that I do not have an answer to. I have my suspicions, but I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I think it can probably be chalked up to the obstinate nature of most human beings. Once they get attached to something or once a particular philosophy becomes embedded in an institution, it's very hard to root it out. And this is the so-called Minnesota model of addiction treatment and the disease model of addiction. So, the question then becomes, is alcohol addiction a permanent disease? And I'm going to briefly tell you the conclusion that I've come to after 5 years of studying this stuff. And of course, This is not the end all be all take on a very important topic, but there's no diseased tissue involved in addiction as far as I can tell. Unlike with a pancreatic tumor, where you have obviously diseased tissue, you have cells doing things they're not supposed to do. Our brains evolve to change and adapt and rewire. Yes, in ways that would show on brain scans in response to changes in our environment or in our lifestyle or even in our diet. So those brain scans that you always see, before addiction, after addiction, there are obvious changes. You would actually see brain changes in someone who decided to become a taxi driver. The area of the brain associated with memory formation or spatial reasoning would actually increase. So inevitably people will say, yes, but the consequences are so drastic and the brains themselves change. And you yourself, Chris, you talk about these deficiencies in neurotransmitters. What are you talking about? And I say, yes, but those deficiencies in nutrients and neurotransmitters and hormones can be resolved with supplementation. So you can rebalance yourself. I don't see this as curing a disease. I see it as rebalancing your system from changes that were, of course, negative. And yes, with negative consequences, but I don't see consequences as being a way to measure whether or not you have a disease. Since addiction affects behavior, there are psychosocial and spiritual aspects of recovering from that addiction. But what I found is that restoring biochemical stability gives you the energy and the optimism that you need to tackle those emotional issues. And lastly, since I don't want to make this slide a 25-minute presentation, I'll say that people with permanent diseases are permanent patients who have to submit to doctors. But the good news is that if you're addicted to alcohol, you can absolutely regain control of your life. This might sound bizarre to you now, as I'm sure it would to myself if I were talking to myself 6 years ago, but my addiction was actually a valuable phase of my life. That's how I see it. That's how I frame it now. And I honestly wouldn't change a thing. I've had so much enlightenment since I quit drinking, and I learned so much about myself, even through those years of brutal addiction and the brutal post-acute withdrawal that I endured while white-knuckling until I found the strategies that finally worked for me. I learned a lot about myself, about the world, about human nature, about basic biochemistry, and I can't tell you how good it feels to reach the other side and finally feel like you're living the life that you were meant to live. Your addiction will then feel like a phase of your life that you've outgrown and which holds a lot of valuable information for you going forward. So I want to tell you about some of my rehab experiences when I was in there. Now here's the good. There were good people there. I felt like I wasn't alone. I had felt like a crazy person before I quit drinking because I was in my apartment drinking up to a handle of vodka a day and literally losing my mind. So I realized there were people in there who even had it worse than I did. There were people with severe cirrhosis. There were people who had been there a dozen times, which was obviously disheartening, but they were nice, decent people, and it was good for me to stop the isolation. Isolation is one of the biggest missing links for people who try to quit drinking on their own. Meditation counselor. There was a guy there who was like a guru. I think he was a priest who had been addicted to alcohol, a former priest. And he got really into meditation. And every morning we started meditating. And I credit him with being able to integrate meditation into my routine going forward. And now studies show that meditation does have a visible effect on the brain and on the way the brain is wired. I had a compassionate counselor who was really a genuinely good person who inspired me to want to become the best person that I possibly could. She was just a little bit dogmatic, but not nearly as dogmatic as the rest of them. And it was very heartwarming to have a relationship with these counselors who were good. We had a cool and fit counselor. We had a guy, he was a former chef, but he was a big guy. He used to play football. And he was the closest thing to a person that I wanted to be like one day. Now, I didn't want to be a counselor in a rehab center, but I admired his calmness and his demeanor and his integrity and the way that he had transcended alcohol addiction, even though I don't think he would have framed it that way because he did believe in the permanent disease model. Now, here was the bad about rehab. I constantly had to defend myself for how much I liked to work out. there was this idea that if you were into fitness, you were going to get cross addicted to it. So all these absurd notions of getting cross addicted to protein powder. I often heard you'll die if you don't go into a sober living facility. I had a huge argument with a counselor. I kind of had a sense that a sober living facility wouldn't be all that sober, and I didn't want to be around people like that. I had a perfectly fine set of people to move in with who were, good guys who I wanted to live with. And she basically said, nope, if you do that, if they even bring a beer in your apartment, you're going to steal it from them and you might end up dying. And I thought, I have more control over myself than that. And she said, you have no control and you never will because you're an addict. So I didn't like hearing that. I heard another counselor who said you can't talk to your friends anymore because they're all drinking buddies. Now, this might be true for some people, but it wasn't true for me. And the idea that I was going to have to give up my most cherished relationships in life with people I'd known since childhood just because I had drank with them on numerous occasions was patently absurd. And I'm really glad I didn't follow that advice. Now, there was also a total omission of the strategies that I just talked about. So there you can kind of look at the good and the bad of my experience. I don't think that it was totally worthless, but the fact is that it cost a lot of money, and I think people would be better served if some of the strategies that we've discussed in this presentation were offered. And as I've said, I think the relapse rates would be much lower. So here's a tip. Don't see quitting drinking as the loss of all fun in your life. The fact is that the same strategies that you use to get to the next phase of your life, that you use to become alcohol free, can be used by anyone to live a fuller life. You're not uniquely deprived. You're actually ahead of the curve because few people ever get an excuse to start living an examined life. I used to hear about the so-called normies all the time when I was in rehab. And these normies apparently had perfectly fine lives. They had the unique privilege of drinking in moderation, and they could enjoy alcohol without becoming addicted to it. And they were just really lucky people. But with the mental clarity that I had as I recovered from alcohol addiction, I began to realize that most people are actually pretty messed up. Everyone has their own thing. My thing was alcohol. But for another guy, it was video games. For someone else, it was porn. For someone else, it was sugar. By making myself the best version of myself that I could be, and that version being alcohol free, I was actually closest to those lucky people who just never had a taste for alcohol to begin with. And I assure you that you can love life without alcohol. All of the chemicals that you need to feel good are already in your own brain. This goes to the biochemistry and the nutrition aspect of it. There's some repair that needs to be done if you want to feel your best going forward. And that's something that I do talk about on my website, Fit Recovery. So here's another tip. Take pride in the identity that you build after you quit drinking. As I said, life gets so much better after you quit drinking. You can biohack your way to feeling good. You can preserve your long-term health while you do this, but try to become something that you've always wanted to be. Think about what your childhood passions were. Think about what you always wanted to be when you grew up. Think about how you can be most fulfilled. And I found that fulfillment is the product of helping other people. So how can you help yourself and help other people at the same time? For me, it was starting Fit Recovery and working with people one-on-one and creating an online course. And I log in every morning to my online course and respond to people, and I can relate to their struggles, and I can relate to the newcomers who come in. I remember what it was like to be in their shoes, and I can also relate to the victories, and that's the best part. After reading a good victory story in my online course, and we get a lot of them because it's quite effective, I feel like I'm on a high unlike anything that alcohol ever could have done for me. And I hear similar things all the time from people who go on to rekindle their passion for painting or architecture or cooking or yoga. And actually yoga is another one of my things. But I've had clients who have quit drinking and, quit their corporate jobs and started their own business. They finally have the clarity and the energy to do so. And it's just the coolest thing to actually go out and do the things that you were fantasizing about doing when you were sitting on a bar stool or on your couch. So here's where you can learn more. You can go to my website. It's fit-recovery.com. You can listen to the Elevation Recovery podcast, which I co-host with Matt Finch, who's the founder of opiateaddictionsupport.com. He's an awesome guy, and we alternate hosting our episodes with people with their own recovery stories, with health experts in various niches pertaining to addiction. And I talked to Matt on some episodes, and the whole podcast idea actually came out of these mastermind calls that we used to have, both furthering our own life optimization techniques. I used to help him with his workouts. I still do every now and then. I used to be a personal trainer. I've always been into fitness. And he tells me about all sorts of biohacking compounds that he comes up with. And it's a lot of fun. We'll have a lot more episodes coming out. The podcast has done well lately, but check out Elevation Recovery. If you like Instagram, you can follow me. I'm Chris Scott FR, as in Chris Scott Fit Recovery. And my book is called Drinking Sucks, and my course is called Total Alcohol Recovery 2.0. I also do private coaching. I'm not cheap, but I'm very effective. My clients get awesome results. And as I said, there are a lot of success stories in my online course, Total Alcohol Recovery 2.0. We have a lot of really, really awesome people, some prolific writers in there. It's actually kind of amazing. We have what I call the anti-tribe tribe, because we're so averse to dogma and everyone's doing their own thing. We have people in there who go to AA. We have people in there who can't stand AA, and yet we have these amazing conversations and these amazing threads in the discussion forums about all of the techniques that people are using to get better. And it's just a really, really nice sense of life in there. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Please like this video. Please subscribe. I'm going to be releasing more. And please share it with someone who needs this video. If you know someone else who can benefit from it, then please send it along. I think that this message is very important. Of course, I'm biased, but I think it's worth keeping in mind these topics if you do go to inpatient rehab, or if someone you know goes to inpatient rehab, because you'll know which topics are not going to get a lot of attention there, or which topics are going to get sneered at or dismissed out of hand. But don't let that fool you. A lot of people have been helped with the strategies discussed in this presentation. So thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned for more.